Did you know that around 70% of stories told in movies and books don't connect with their audiences? That's a staggering number. Despite the time and effort spent crafting a tale, many storytellers miss the mark. So, what's going wrong? Studies show that when people read or watch stories, they remember just 10% of what they hear. But add a compelling narrative, and that number jumps to 70%. This proves that the right storytelling techniques can make all the difference. In this article, we'll uncover the biggest mistakes that lead stories to fall flat. We'll explore why too much information can overwhelm your audience, how dull characters can drive people away, and why weak endings leave viewers feeling empty. Plus, we'll share simple, effective strategies to turn your storytelling from forgettable to unforgettable. Get ready to dive deep into the art of storytelling. By the end, you'll have the tools to craft stories that stick with people long after they've finished reading or watching. Let's transform your storytelling game together. Chapter 1: The Curse of Information Overload. Why facts alone will never win hearts. We live in a world overflowing with information. And while facts are important, they rarely move people. One study by psychologist Jerome Bruner found that people are 22 times more likely to remember a fact when it's part of a story. This shows how storytelling taps into something deeper than just data. Yet, many storytellers make the mistake of bombarding their audience with too much information. They focus on delivering facts, but they forget to build emotional connections. Storytelling isn't about showing how much you know, it's about making the audience feel something. When you overload listeners with too many details, they tune out. Think about the last time you read a dry, fact-filled article. How much of it do you remember? Probably not much. Instead of filling your story with endless information, focus on the emotions behind the facts. Stories that trigger emotions, joy, fear, hope, are the ones that stick with people. To fix this, try stripping your story down to its core. What's the central message or emotion you want to convey? For example, if you're telling a story about starting a business, don't just talk about sales figures. Talk about the anxiety of risking everything. That's what resonates. In the book Made to Stick by Chip and Dan Heath, they emphasize simplicity. They explain how stripping down your message to its essential core makes it memorable. So, instead of layering on facts, ask yourself, what's the one takeaway my audience needs? Chapter 2: The Bland Protagonist Syndrome. How forgettable characters kill great stories. Stories often fail because the characters are boring or unrelatable. People don't connect with characters who feel too perfect or one-dimensional. In fact, Joseph Campbell's Hero's Journey highlights that the most compelling protagonists are flawed. They're relatable because they struggle, fail, and grow. Consider this: when Harry Potter first learns he's a wizard, he isn't perfect. He's unsure, overwhelmed, and sometimes even scared. These flaws make him more human and allow the audience to see themselves in him. Contrast that with characters who are unrealistically flawless; they're much harder to relate to. To avoid the bland protagonist syndrome, give your characters depth. They should have goals, fears, and flaws. Characters who are too perfect are hard to believe. People want to see someone they can root for, not someone who never makes mistakes. An interesting example comes from Brené Brown's work on vulnerability. She argues that showing vulnerability is a strength, not a weakness. Apply this to your storytelling: let your characters be vulnerable, let them fail, and let them struggle. That's what draws people in. A quick tip: build backstory for your characters. Even if you don't share every detail, knowing their fears and motivations will help you write them more realistically. When you do this, your audience can emotionally invest in them. And when people care about your characters, they care about your story. Chapter 3: The Unraveled Thread. Keeping your narrative tight and tantalizing. A common reason stories fail is that they lose focus. Imagine a string unraveling. It starts off strong, but then it frays into different directions. The same thing happens when your narrative isn't tight. Audiences get lost or bored when the story meanders without a clear direction. In a survey by the Harvard Business Review, 55% of people said they're more likely to stop reading or watching content that is poorly structured. This highlights how crucial a clear narrative is for keeping attention. To avoid this, Think of your story as a thread that guides your audience from point A to point B. Every detail you include should serve the bigger picture. If a detail doesn't move the story forward, cut it. It might be tempting to add lots of subplots or side stories, but simplicity is your friend here. Another great tip from Pix's storytelling rules: you must keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. Just because something seems clever or entertaining to you doesn't mean it will serve the story. Always ask yourself, does this add value? Structure is everything. Try using a simple narrative arc, setup, conflict, and resolution. This gives your story a beginning, middle, and end, keeping it clear and focused. And don't forget to build tension. Even in stories that aren't action-packed, the tension comes from what's at stake. What might the protagonist lose? What obstacles are in the way? Finally, E.M. Forster in Aspects of the Novel said, "A story is a narrative of events arranged in their time sequence, but a plot is also a narrative of events, with the emphasis on causality. This means that every event in your story should cause the next, not just be a series of disconnected happenings." By tightening your story's thread, you keep your audience engaged from beginning to end. If you're finding this information valuable, consider subscribing to stay updated on more storytelling tips and tricks. Chapter 4, The Emotionless Plot Trap: Why Conflict, Not Complexity, Drives Engagement. One of the most common storytelling mistakes is thinking complexity equals quality. A convoluted plot can confuse your audience rather than engage them. In fact, HBO's popular show Game of Thrones is often cited as an example of how complex narratives only work when anchored by deep emotional conflict. The complexity alone isn't what made the show engaging, it was the intense conflicts between the characters. Conflict is the backbone of any good story. Without it, the plot feels flat. Think about it: why do people watch movies or read books? It's not for perfectly smooth situations. We're drawn in by the tension. We want to see characters overcome obstacles. When a story lacks conflict, the audience has no reason to care. In a study on storytelling, Paul J. Zak, a neuroeconomist, found that stories that include conflict, especially ones involving human struggle, cause the brain to release oxytocin. This empathy hormone is what helps us connect with others. So, if you want your audience to connect with your story, you need to introduce real stakes. A simple way to avoid the emotionless plot trap is to always ask, what's at stake? Whether it's internal conflict, like a character battling their own fears, or external conflict, fighting against an antagonist, there should be something at risk. In his book The Anatomy of Story, John Truby explains that a story is not a series of events. It is a sequence of emotional transitions. The audience needs to feel these transitions, and conflict is what drives them. It's through struggle that characters grow, and through witnessing that struggle, your audience grows too. Chapter 5, The Absence of Subtext: How Subtlety Separates Amateurs from Masters. A lot of storytellers make the mistake of being too on the nose. They spell everything out for the audience. But great storytelling leaves room for interpretation. It uses subtext. Subtext is what lies beneath the surface, the things unsaid but felt. And it's what turns a good story into a great one. Consider this: when you watch a movie and a character says, "I'm fine," but you know they're not, that's subtext at work. Subtext allows your audience to actively engage with the story, piecing together hidden layers. It's the difference between telling and showing. In fact, in Beyond Reason, Roger Fisher explains how effective communication often relies on what's not said. In storytelling, the same principle applies. Audiences appreciate when they're trusted to understand more than just the words being spoken. To add subtext to your storytelling, think about how your characters communicate through action, not just dialogue. What are they doing when they're not talking? What emotions are bubbling beneath the surface that they might not openly express? Sometimes the most powerful scenes in a story are those where nothing is said, but everything is felt. Ernest Hemingway was a master of subtext. He once said, "If a writer of prose knows enough of what he is writing about, he may omit things that he knows, and the reader will have a feeling of those things." This is called the iceberg theory, where only a small portion of the story is visible, but the depth is hidden beneath the surface. When you master subtext, you add richness to your stories. Your audience won't just listen or watch passively. They'll become emotionally involved, trying to understand the deeper meaning behind every word and action. If you found these insights helpful, don't forget to subscribe for more storytelling tips that can help you create stories that truly resonate.